By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe was collapsing inward on itself. German front lines were retreating from France, Belgium, and the western edges of the Reich. With that retreat came something the Nazi state had never planned for. Capture, entire units surrendered. Supply personnel were abandoned. Clerks, nurses, radio operators, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, and teenage girls pressed into service through the Reichsarbeitsdienst and Luftwaffe suddenly became prisoners of enemies they were taught to fear. For many German women captured by American forces in late 1944 and early 1945, the first shock was not the capture itself. It was the silence afterward. No beatings, no screaming, no revenge. Only shouted instructions in English. Confusion followed, then movement, long, exhausting movement away from the front. They were marched to temporary holding areas first. These were not camps as most imagine, but improvised enclosures, abandoned farms, schoolyards, factories, or fields fenced with wire. In France and Belgium, US Army processing teams worked under extreme pressure. Tens of thousands of prisoners arrived daily. Food was scarce, shelter was worse. Winter came early, and the ground was wet, frozen, and unforgiving beneath thin boots. Women were separated from male prisoners quickly, often within hours. This was less moral than logistical. US Army regulations required segregation when possible, and commanders feared discipline problems in mixed compounds during shortages and exhaustion. German women were grouped together, sometimes in requisitioned buildings, sometimes in canvas tents, sometimes in wooden barracks hastily assembled by engineers. In one such compound, according to post-war accounts, a small but telling incident occurred. The barracks were bare wooden floors, wooden benches, no padding, no backs. The women had marched or been transported for hours, sometimes days. Many were undernourished. Some wore thin skirts or coats never meant for winter duty. When ordered to sit, relief lasted minutes. Then pain began. The benches were rough planks nailed to frames. After days of cold and dehydration, sitting worsened the ache. Pressure on hips and tailbones became sharp and unbearable. Some shifted constantly. Others stood back up, preferring pain in their legs to pain in their bones. A few laughed quietly, the kind of laughter born from exhaustion. Then someone said it aloud in German, "Sitting hurts." At first the Americans did not understand. The guards were young men, infantry replacements, MPs, rear area troops, many no older than the prisoners. Their German was limited to commands. But discomfort is universal, and pain needs no translation. The shifting bodies, the grimaces, the way women sat, stood, then sat again. One guard gestured, asking what the problem was. A German woman pointed to the bench, then her hips and back, miming pain with careful movements. Another repeated the words slowly, "Sitting hurts." The guard frowned and pressed his hand against the wood, testing it. He nodded, not fully understanding the language, but grasping the meaning. Then he walked away without explanation. The women expected nothing to happen. Years of propaganda taught them American soldiers were brutal and undisciplined. Complaints were pointless. In the German system, weakness was punished and discomfort ignored. Orders were absolute and suffering irrelevant. So when the guard returned an hour later with two others carrying something unexpected, the barracks fell silent. They brought blankets, US Army issue, olive drab, coarse but clean. They laid them carefully across the benches. In some sections, straw was added beneath the blankets, scavenged from nearby farms. In others, boards were adjusted or replaced. No speeches were given, no explanation offered. The guards worked quietly, then stepped back and gestured. The women hesitated. One sat slowly. Her shoulders dropped. The pain did not vanish, but it dulled. Others followed. The bench was still hard. The cold still crept upward, but the difference was unmistakable and real. This was not kindness as stories often frame it. It was practical, quiet, almost bureaucratic. Yet it shattered expectations more than any dramatic gesture could. It contradicted everything they had been taught to believe about captivity. Over the following weeks, similar moments accumulated. In several US-run female compounds in France and later Germany, guards arranged extra clothing when possible. Oversized jackets appeared. Gloves were issued when supplies allowed. In one case recorded by a US Army nurse, women with severe foot pain were allowed to remove boots during rest. Under German discipline, this was unthinkable. Here it was treated not as a medical necessity. Medical inspections followed US Army procedure, not ideology. Lice were treated methodically. Frostbite was taken seriously. Menstrual needs, rarely written in reports but recalled in memoirs, were handled awkwardly, yet practically through supplies and improvisation. There was embarrassment on both sides, but also recognition these issues were not punishments, only realities. The women noticed something else. Americans rarely shouted unless necessary. Orders were clear. Discipline existed, but it was consistent and predictable. When rules were broken, consequences followed, but they were specific. No arbitrary beatings. No collective punishment for one person's mistake. For many German female prisoners, this was their first exposure to authority that did not rely on fear alone. That did not make captivity easy. Food was basic. Canned rations, soup, bread when available. Hunger was constant. News from home was non-existent. Many did not know if their families were alive or buried beneath advancing fronts. Air raids still echoed in the distance. The war remained present, but details mattered. The bench that no longer cut into bone. The blanket that smelled of soap instead of smoke. The guard who shrugged when thanked, as if it were nothing. By early 1945, as American forces moved deeper into Germany, the number of female prisoners grew. Some camps became permanent, others were holding areas before transport. The system was strained, but its principles remained largely intact. The Geneva Convention was not abstract to the US Army. It was doctrine, training, inspections, paperwork. Officers were held accountable. Abuse was investigated, not perfectly, but often enough to discourage cruelty rather than reward it. The realization came slowly. They were not being starved on purpose. They were not humiliated for sport. They were not invisible. Years later, many struggled to reconcile this with what they had been taught since childhood. Some felt guilt for being treated decently while a regime they served committed atrocities elsewhere. Others felt confusion. A smaller number felt gratitude, though even that word felt dangerous in post-war Germany. Nearly all remembered the same moments: the day the benches were fixed, the day the blankets arrived, the realization that suffering was not required to prove defeat, and that captivity did not always mean deliberate cruelty. In the vast scale of World War II, these details barely register. No battles were won because of padded benches. No campaigns shifted because a guard listened. History rarely pauses for such moments, even when they change lives quietly. Yet for the women who sat and felt less pain than expected, something shifted. The enemy became human. Authority became something other than terror. Survival depended not only on endurance, but on adapting to a world behaving differently. After the war, many women faded back into civilian life. Some rebuilt, some struggled. Some never spoke of captivity again. But in letters, diaries, and interviews recorded decades later, the same idea surfaced repeatedly. Sometimes quoted directly, sometimes paraphrased, the sentence remained: "We thought it would be worse." A quiet admission that fear had been louder than reality, and that expectations shaped suffering as much as circumstances did. Sometimes history is shaped not by what happens, but by what does not. No punishment followed the complaint. No retaliation came. Only a blanket, a repaired bench, and the realization that pain did not have to be the point. If you found this story worth remembering, consider subscribing so these moments are not lost to time. Like the video to help it reach more people, and comment below where you are watching from today.